welcome to the Human Being Human. This is the Human Being Human Pod. This is the Human Being Human Pod. This is the Human Being Welcome Pod to the Human Being Human Podcast. This is the Human Being Human Podcast.
Our hands and our feet are torn by sharp rocks, and our trail is marked by our blood. At last I see a rift in the rocks. A little way beyond there are green prairies. The swift running water, the Niobrara, pours down between the green hills. There are the graves of my fathers. There again we will pitch our teepee and build our fires. I see the light of the world and of liberty just ahead. But in the center of the path, there stands a man. Behind him, I see soldiers in number like the leaves of the trees. If that man gives me the permission, I may pass on to life and liberty. If he refuses, I must go back and sink beneath the flood. You are that man. Chief Standing Bear, 1879, Omaha, Nebraska. If America has a mythology, it's that of the wild, wild West and the American frontier. Our golden age was the gold rush. And because history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, history becomes legend, and legend becomes myth. As a Nebraskan, I can't help but view my state in this light, imagining myself wading up the Missouri River with Lewis and Clark, glimpsing the Great Plains as they once were, in their pristine and uncompromised beauty. This is a time in our history that is very easy to romanticize, and perhaps justifiably so. As human beings, America's mythology speaks to our instincts, ambitions, and willingness to go anywhere our two legs can carry us. However, I always have to keep in mind the realities and experiences of all involved during this time period. And it's not quite as romantic to imagine wading up the Missouri River as a young man named York, the slave of William Clark. Despite his invaluable and often life-saving contributions to Lewis and Clark's voyage of discovery, York was not granted his freedom by Clark upon their return home. When it comes to the reality of America's golden age, there is no silver lining to be had. In the year 1814, following in the wake of Lewis and Clark's expedition to the Pacific Northwest, Spanish fur trader and explorer Manuel Lisa established Nebraska's first trading post, Fort Lisa, 12 miles north of present-day Omaha. Known by history as Nebraska's first European settler, Manuel Lisa spent the summers planting crops along the Missouri River and the winters trading furs and goods with the Native Americans of the Great Plains. His wife Mary would later join him at Fort Lisa, earning herself the title of the first European woman settler in Nebraska. Although civil at first, Fort Lisa, and the many forts that would be constructed in the following decades, would be just one of many on the prairies that would tear apart this state and its original inhabitants. This land is not my land. This land is not our land. This land was their land.
I've been awake for
Welcome to the Human Being Human podcast. I'm your host and creator, Carrington Cooper. If you've made it to this point and decided this podcast isn't for you, thanks for sticking around this long. So far, this series has taken us through liquid hot magma, frozen seas, lush forests, volcanoes, and frozen tundras. We've looked at geography, paleontology, archaeology, and anthropology, and we've gotten to know the various Native American tribes that once occupied the Great Plains. As the first Europeans make contact with the original inhabitants of Nebraska, this episode's story will be told through history, sociology, and civics. If that doesn't sound like the beginning to a grand action-packed summer blockbuster, then I don't know what does. In the United States, there are roughly 75,000 people that are over 100 years old or older, so-called centurions. This fact means that 75,000 people living in this country were born before Native Americans received full birthright citizenship in the United States. The year was 1924, less than a century ago. While the 14th Amendment of the Constitution defines a citizen as any person born or naturalized in the United States, Native Americans were not considered born in this country, but born within their own tribal groups. The natives of this land once had to apply for citizenship in the same way any foreigner from Canada, Mexico, or England might. One of the key major victories in the legal battle leading to full Native American birthright citizenship took place in Omaha, Nebraska. The year was 1879, and the name of the trial was Standing Bear versus Crook. An aptly and ironically named legal case, but Crook refers to General Crook in this instance. In a landmark decision, Judge Elmer S. Dundee ruled that, quote, "An Indian is a person and is entitled to rights and protections under the law and Constitution," and thus began a new and somewhat brighter chapter in the dark and complex history of European colonization, and my home of Nebraska. I'm quite aware and fully understand the context of Chief Standing Bear declaring, "You are that man," in that 1878 courtroom. I am that man. He was referring to my personal lineage and history, as I'm of European descent, mostly Czech, and my family was only able to establish themselves in Nebraska because of massive military intervention and American manifest destiny that swept across the Great Plains during the 19th century, aka the 1800s. It's difficult to fit the square peg in the round hole that is my love and nostalgia for Nebraska, which was torn apart by forts, outposts, and foreign settlements. Luckily for us, this is a history podcast and not a math podcast, so I don't have to solve that problem today. Setting aside all of that geometry for now, this is a time in American history that is dramatic, exciting, and almost theatrical in nature. It's the clash of civilization, battle of cultures, heroes versus villains. It's cowboys and Indians, right? It's mythology, legends, and folktales. Except it's real history with a capital H. And because we're now entering the age of a written history, the human being story in North America becomes much more personal as well. Not only do we have archives and records of the who, what, wheres, and whens, we have journals, memoirs, and even the earliest photojournalism written by the people that experienced this paradigm shift in human experience. And for those of us used to the traditional Western way of thinking, we're accustomed to, and like having, access to dates and times and years and names and places, all in chronological order, neatly arranged with proper citations and footnotes. good stuff. As we left off in the previous episode, the people of the plains were facing a mysterious crisis among their communities. The majority of Central Plain villages and settlements were left abandoned, and whole communities and tribal groups moved on to greener pastures, figuratively or perhaps literally. They sought refuge in the river valleys of the Midwest and would not return to the prairies for centuries, with many not returning at all. The origin of this destructive turmoil is still not entirely known. It may have been due to climatic disruption, as drastic as a little ice age, trade disorders, or likely a combination of negative factors that contributed to the desertion of the Great Plains. Bear in mind, the continent was horseless during this time period, and had been for 8,000 years, so the Native Americans who resorted back to a semi-nomadic lifestyle did so with little more than their family dogs to help them with the move. Archaeological records show that after the people of the plains left during the 13 and 1400s, they began to return to the prairies at the beginning of the 17th century, aka the 1600s. The reintroduction of the horse to North America by the Spanish during the 1500s was likely a major factor in the migration of these groups. It was during this turbulent period in Great Plains Native American history that the first European contact occurred. During school growing up, we were often taught that this period of history is referred to as the Age of Discovery. While this term is not inaccurate, as certainly plenty of discovery was taking place, the motivations behind these discoveries were complex, to put it mildly. The earliest Europeans that interacted with the natives of North America were a mixed blend of intrepid explorers, die-hard scientists, and ruthless conquerors. There was genuine scientific curiosity and thirst for knowledge and discovery, but there was also genuine thirst for blood and treasure. Among these men, there certainly was the man. The story of European colonization in Nebraska begins in 1492, as it must, when Christopher Columbus landed in the present-day Bahamas off the coast of Florida, roughly 1,700 miles from Valley County, Nebraska, claiming the New World for Spain. Before you can say God, gold, guns, the rest of the continent was being explored by various political, scientific, and religious factions, often overlapping. By 1541, the Spanish explorer and conqueror Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was the first European to navigate the interior of North America, traveling with his party all the way up to present-day Kansas, but no further north. It was here that he claimed the entire territory for Spain, including Nebraska, although no outposts or settlements were ever built by the Spanish in that region. In 1682, the French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, completed an expedition down the Mississippi River, claiming all the land drained by the river for France. This included the region that is present-day Nebraska as well. But just as the Spaniards, no French forts or settlements were ever constructed in Nebraska during this time, and still no European had yet stepped into the Cornhusker state. The land that would become Nebraska went untouched by European explorers throughout the entirety of the 15 and 1600s. The first European explorer to officially set foot in Nebraska was also the first to name it. Sort of. Born in Normandy, France in 1679, Antoine Venard de Bourgmont would be the first foreign explorer to set foot into the region. At age 19, Bourgmont was caught poaching the lands of his local monastery back in Normandy. Instead of paying the fine, He fled to France's colonies in North America to avoid imprisonment, where he lived for the next 27 years, trading, trapping, and compiling maps and charts of these new lands. In the year 1713, he began writing a book with a title that Leslie Knope would be proud of. Quote, "Exact descriptions of Louisiana, of its harbors, lands and rivers, and names of the Indian tribes that occupy it, and the commerce and advantages to be derived therefrom, for the establishment of a colony." He then traveled up the Missouri River and began to record his observations and map the uncharted lands. In March of 1714, Bourgmont reached the mouth of the Platte River. He named it, with a perfect French accent, the Rivière Nebraskière, using an Odo word meaning flat water. The French would later reapply their word for flat and rename the river the Platte River. After establishing trade relations with the local natives and mapping the region, Bourgmont returned south and wrote, with a title Leslie Knope would not be proud of, "The route to be taken to ascend the Missouri River." This expedition was the first documented report of travels this far north on the Missouri River, which officially gave the Cornhusker state its name, Nebraska. There are numerous prehistoric tribes that lived in the river valleys of Nebraska when the earliest Europeans, including Bourgmont, first made contact, enough to fill several episodes worth of podcasts. I'd like to focus on one particular group, as they resided in the region of Nebraska I grew up in, the Loup River Valley. Archaeological evidence and records show that, after tribal people left the Great Plains during the 13 and 1400s, they began to return in large at the beginning of the 1600s. One of these tribal groups is known as the Lower Loup culture, which left an impressive and thorough archaeological record in central Nebraska. Many village ruins remain along the Lower Loup and Platte River valleys, from Howard County to Saunders County, as well as sites in the Republican River Basin. The Lower Loup tribal groups raised squash, beans, and corn in the same lush river valleys that farmers still raise these crops today. After their seeds were planted each spring, they left their villages and spent the summers hunting the great bison herds across the plains of Nebraska, returning to their communities in time to harvest crops in the fall. Their work, however, as the work of all farmers, was not close to done, and in the late fall, the Lower Loup people set out once again for the winter hunt, hunting birds, fish, and other small game. These farmers would have been some of the first Nebraska Native Americans from my own backyard to come into contact with the earliest Europeans. The first exchanges between the people of the plains and the Europeans were relatively violence-free, all things considered and looking in hindsight. During the 1500s and 1600s, fur trading was the name of the game in the region, which required some amount of negotiations and diplomacy. But with so many countries making so many claims on the land that would become Nebraska, clashes between civilizations were inevitable. Nebraska's first major battle occurred in the year 1720. In the early 1700s, Spain claimed most of the Central Plains as their exclusive territory, including modern-day Nebraska. The Spanish were very concerned with protecting their claims to the potentially enormous trade opportunities with the Native Americans on the prairies. But it had been the Frenchman, Bourgmont, who had reached the Platte first and made contact with the local natives. Tensions increased between the two countries, and in 1719, war broke out between France and Spain. The Spanish government in New Mexico decided it was necessary to counter French incursions into Nebraska, territory they felt rightfully belonged to them. On the morning of June 16, 1720, Lieutenant General Pedro de Villasuer led the Spanish army out of Santa Fe, north across the desert, and to the plains of Nebraska. His orders? To capture French fur traders entering Spanish territory, and discover and disrupt their plans. Little did he know, however, that this expedition would end in death and disaster for nearly all members of his party, including Villesur himself. In August of 1720, General Villesur's army arrived at the Platte River, somewhere near present-day Grand Island, Nebraska, in Hall County. He and his troops crossed the Platte River and then made their way across the Loup River, where Villesur began encountering Oto and Pawnee tribespeople. The Spanish attempted to negotiate with them along their route, eventually stopping their expedition near present-day Colfax County. Villesur became very nervous about the numbers of the local and seemingly hostile natives, whose villages were just south of the Platte, near the towns of Bellwood and Linwood in present-day Butler County. And so, Villesur turned his army around and returned to the Loup River. They crossed the river once again and set up camp in a meadow covered with tall grass, located just south of where the city of Columbus, Nebraska stands today, about an hour south of where I graduated college. At dawn on August 14th, 1720, a large force of Native American Pawnee warriors, accompanied by French fur traders, attacked Villesur's army and campsite. Most of the Spanish were still asleep, and the tall grass made it easy for the Pawnee to approach them undetected. General Villesur was killed immediately in the first wave of attacks, while the soldiers around him, still alive, formed a defensive circle. Spanish soldiers who were holding horses nearby managed to saddle up, and 3 men charged through the native forces towards the circle of troops. One of the 3 men who made the charge was successful in reaching the group, and 7 soldiers were able to escape via horseback. Most of the other men, however, were not so fortunate. Although the battle lasted for only a few short minutes, when it was all over, 35 Spaniards were dead, including General Villesur, a priest, 1 civilian, 1 lieutenant, 1 corporal, the quartermaster, and 8 soldiers. This battle, quote, was a massacre, the first of many that would tear the people of the plains apart from their lands. The Spanish, French, British, and most of Europe continued to battle and negotiate and maneuver for control of North America and the Great Plains during the 18th century, aka the 1700s. In 1763, France lost nearly all of its North American possessions, including Nebraska, following its defeat to Great Britain in the 7 Years' War, the final in a series of wars between the two countries during the mid-1700s. This war, sometimes called the First True World War, would pay a heavy financial toll on Great Britain, eventually compelling them to levy new taxes on their American colonies, which was a wonderful idea and turned out to be a great decision. However, not all was lost for France, as they had secretly given all of its land west of the Mississippi, known as the Louisiana Territory, to Spain, France's ally in the 7 Years' War. In the year 1800, France regained the land back from Spain, under the giant historical figure Napoleon Bonaparte. But Napoleon had plenty of his own wars and revolutions to finance, and finding the Louisiana Territory too difficult and costly to defend, listed it on the market. In an unprecedented and perhaps unconstitutional move, Thomas Jefferson and the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory, a 828,000 square mile, 530 million square acre piece of prime real estate. In a deal any old Nebraska farmer would be proud of, the U.S. paid France $15 million for the entire territory, or roughly 4 cents an acre, equivalent to $2.5 billion in today's money. "What a steal," said the Native Americans. When it comes to Thomas Jefferson's legacy and complex personal life, all I can say is this: great men are rarely good men. In the year 1804, President Thomas Jefferson selected Meriwether Lewis to head an expedition that would explore the newly purchased land, wanting to assure the U.S. and his political adversaries that he had made a wise investment. Lewis accepted the duty and asked William Clark to help him lead the first state-sponsored expedition into the heart of North America. President Jefferson had ambitious plans for the expedition, called the Corps of Discovery, including scientific observations, map-making, diplomacy, and carving out new routes for the lucrative fur trade. Lewis and Clark recruited approximately 48 men to begin the expedition. Of course, some had no choice in the matter, including William Clark's slave, York. Eventually, 33 people were part of the permanent party that traveled from Nebraska to the Pacific Ocean and back. 34 if we count the Newfoundland dog by the name of Seaman, who belonged to Captain Lewis. The Corps of Discovery entered Nebraska for the first time on July 15, 1804, making base camp near the Little Nemaha River. Clark wrote in his journal that, quote, "I saw great quantities of grapes, plums of 2 kinds, wild cherries of 2 kinds, hazelnuts, and gooseberries." The Lewis and Clark expedition then continued up the Missouri River to explore the new territory and make new contacts with the Native Americans. On July 21, 1804, they reached the mouth of the Platte River where it enters the Missouri. The following day, the expedition went 10 more miles upriver to attempt communication with the local tribes. The Oto were the first tribe they eventually encountered, and they agreed to meet Lewis and Clark on the west bank of the Missouri River, not the east bank. On August 3, 1804, the two groups held their first council at this historic location. The Americans offered gifts of roast meat, flour, and cornmeal, while the natives reciprocated with baskets of watermelons. This meeting place on the west bank of the Missouri River would become known as the Council Bluff. This is not Council Bluffs, Iowa. I repeat, this is not Iowa.
Not Iowa.
After establishing diplomatic relations with the people of the plains, Lewis and Clark continued up the Missouri River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The rest, as they say, is mythology. In the aftermath of Lewis and Clark's voyage of discovery, many other excursions through the Louisiana Territory were planned and launched, all hoping to establish their footholds in Nebraska by forming trading partnerships, and, if that failed, exerting religious and military authority. It wasn't long before the man constructed the first forts, outposts, and settlements on the Great Plains, including Fort Lisa, and began tearing apart the land from its native inhabitants. In 1819, 15 years after their expedition through Nebraska, Fort Atkinson was constructed on the same Missouri River bluff where Lewis and Clark held their council with the Oto tribes. Located just east of present-day Fort Calhoun, Nebraska, in Washington County, Fort Atkinson was the first United States Army post to be established west of the Missouri River in the still unorganized region of the Louisiana Purchase. Officially outfitted in 1820, the U.S. Army had several key objectives for constructing this outpost on the plains. First and foremost, the U.S. military at Fort Atkinson was to establish relations with the local tribes, manage disagreements between warring groups, and exercise military authority if needed, or not. Part of these negotiations included preventing the natives from trading with the British, who were still active in the lower Mississippi River Valley. As more explorers, traders, trappers, missionaries, and other overland trail travelers made their way across Nebraska, Fort Atkinson provided protection, occupations, and even entertainment to these early European settlers. Women worked washing the soldiers' uniforms, children could attend grade school, and books could be checked out at the library, charging 2 cents a day for late fees. Fort Atkinson even sported a bowling alley, a fact my father-in-law would be thrilled to learn. Although Fort Atkinson was eventually abandoned in 1827, more forts, outposts, and the first permanent settlements would continue to crop up on the plains during the 1800s. The man was here to stay. Nothing would give me dysentery quicker than excluding the Oregon Trail from a podcast about Nebraska. Between the 1830s and 1860s, the famous Oregon, Mormon, and California trails all passed through the Platte River Valley on their way to the Rocky Mountains, and eventually Utah, Oregon, and California. The intrepid people that dared this arduous trek included explorers, fur traders, covered wagon pioneers, and many others seeking religious, economic, and political freedom. Fertile land in Oregon, tales of gold in California, and promises of milk and honey in Utah convinced thousands to cast themselves adrift amidst an ocean of grass and prairie. Although these trails didn't run through my home of Valley County, they weren't far away, with the closest crossing in Merritt County, near Central City, Nebraska, about 70 miles southeast of my hometown of Ord. In the year 1844, the U.S. Secretary of War recommended that a chain of forts and outposts be built from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains to shelter and protect the travelers along the Oregon, Mormon, and California trails. Colonel Stephen Watts Kearny was ordered to complete this task. After initially establishing a site at Table Creek, near present-day Nebraska City, he moved construction to a more suitable location in central Nebraska and established Fort Kearny, technically Fort Kearny II, roughly 70 miles southwest from my home of Ord, Nebraska. Initially, the fort was called Fort Chili's, before being named in honor of Colonel Kearny. Ironically and tragically, there isn't a Chili's in present-day Kearny, Nebraska. At this time, the outpost was the only fort between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains, and thousands of covered wagons camped there every summer. On some days, it wasn't uncommon to see more than 500 ox teams pass by the fort. But as railroads began replacing wagons, the once well-traveled trails began to wane and need in use. In 1871, Fort Kearny was discontinued as a military post. The buildings were torn down, and the land was opened up for homesteading. Many decades later, several of the buildings were reconstructed, and in 1959, Fort Kearny was declared to be a state historical park. Today, Fort Kearny can still be visited in Kearny, Nebraska, just off of Interstate 80. Just look for the giant arch covering the highway. It can be easy to miss. An entire podcast series could be done on the forts of Nebraska alone. We could call it a Fortcast. To mention a few others that may sound familiar to some listeners: Fort Omaha, Fort Crook, Fort McPherson, Fort Niobrara, Fort Mitchell, Fort Sidney, Fort Robinson, as well as Fort Hartsuff, located just 11 miles from my hometown of Ord, Nebraska. The town of Ord was named after Major General Edward Ord, who commanded the Department of the Platte, a military division based out of Omaha. It was under his authority that Fort Hartsuff was built and operated, leading to the foundation of my hometown of Ord, Nebraska. That is where this episode concludes, and where we'll begin the next. Get ready to settle in, literally, as we'll take a deep dive into the settlement of Valley County, Nebraska. Thank you once again for listening to the Human Being Human podcast. I'm your host and creator, Carrington Cooper. Please join me for the next episode, and we'll see each other on the other side. You can follow this podcast on social media, including Facebook, Twitter, as well as Patreon. I'll be sharing and posting links to all the references mentioned throughout this series, as well as any other stories, videos, articles, or other cool and nifty stuff that might be of interest. Today's episode featured my former band, Evergreen, and our song, Every Color on the Wheel, recorded at PH Studios in Lincoln, Nebraska. As always, I appreciate all of your ears and support, and we'll see you next time.